Hello, welcome to the Saïd Business School. My name is Pegram Harrison. I'm a lecturer here and your host for this series of events called Engaging with the Humanities. As you can tell, this one involves some audio elements, and we have a mic that is precisely aimed for the instrument, but not for me. So I'm going to do the weird business of sitting down and talking to you just for a few seconds to introduce our guest. And for those of you that are new to this series of events, to explain a bit about what it is. For some years now, the business school has been engaging with the humanities division of the university in all kinds of ways. This is one expression of that, where we invite people from the humanities division, the departments that are in the category of the humanities, to come share with us their work. And where we think there's some resonance with our work, that's interesting, but not really the main point. More interesting is seeing how other people think in ways that might be similar or not, but having the opportunity to seek correspondence, seek resonance, that's the real advantage of being a business school embedded in a university with its deepest traditions rooted in the humanities. Now, for those of you that have been to this series on other occasions, you'll know that we have reached into many different corners of the humanities riches of the university. But I'm particularly gratified that on this occasion we're able to reach into not one but two, a classicist and a musician in one person. That's a really efficient way of proceeding. The theme of creativity and innovation is not one that you would necessarily associate with the idea of classicism, but what's particularly innovative about this person and his work and his presentation is that he shows exactly how that works, how looking backward we can look forward, or how looking forward is as much a matter of understanding where we've come from, and how that's as useful in the context of the modern world as it is in thinking about the way the modern world came to be what it is. Now, Armand D'Angour is someone of such cosmopolitan complexity that I'm not even going to attempt to introduce him in any specific way, other than to say that he is a fellow of Jesus College, where he's the tutor in classics. He's also an instructor in the cello at the Royal Academy of Music. Is that right, or is it the school?
College.
College, Royal College of Music. There's several institutions with similar names, so Royal College of Music. A great friend of this initiative of engaging with humanities. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome him here. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thanks very much. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you very much, Pegram, for inviting me. What I want to talk about in about 30 minutes, because I know some of you have to leave, is the idea of innovation. Because clearly, as business people, innovation is one of those things which is very important. We all know that in the world today, in academia as well as in business, of course, and it depends so much on individuals, although the individual creator is no longer the key to business innovation. Nonetheless, what one has to accept is that what matters is what goes on inside individuals if one's trying to be creative and innovative. Now, what I've done is a couple of things. One is I wrote a book published in 2011 called The Greeks and the New, in which I took my own academic subject out of the classics, and I looked at how the ancient Greeks were this incredibly innovative nation that they were. I looked at many of their crucial cultural innovations, such as their invention of the alphabet that we all use, the greatest piece of software that still exists, the invention of money, a system of first monetized economy in ancient Greece, their ideas about theatre, about philosophy, these things they all came up with in a very short space of a few centuries. And I asked the question, what was it that led to those innovations? What were the conditions? And can we derive anything about the roots of creative innovation from looking at the ancient Greek experience? So I feel that I have got to a stage where I have a few answers to that. The other side of my interest, which is music, feeds into that as well, because this Humanities series is going to expose you who are studying or teaching business matters to something different. And you all will know that exposure to difference gives one individually a new lease of life creatively. So if one's studying and thinking about the same thing all the time, figures or balance sheets or business or marketing or whatever, you need to switch off. So in many ways, just hearing something different, going and listening to music, playing games or doing something out of the normal run of things is going to help anyone to switch out of their immediate focus and return refreshed and hopefully more creative. So, I mean, I could do worse than simply play a concert. And you'd go away and think that, you'd had an interesting half an hour of music, especially if I'm playing some great music by Bach, for example. I hope that that would be one effect. But this being Oxford, one also needs to subject such an experience to a little bit of analysis. And so that's what I aim to do. But I'm going to start by playing, since I have my prop, my cello here, by playing some music and just say a little bit about why this particular piece I'm going to play already informs us about the ideas of innovation that I will then go on to talk about. In fact, I will just talk in two sections after I play. One will be the question of the conditions that promote creative innovation, and then the mechanisms that might be derived from our study of, say, the ancient world, the classical world, which is the historical period I happen to know, those mechanisms that can then be applied, I believe, to almost any innovation or innovative project that exists. So, I don't know how many of you play an instrument or know this one. Some people say they've never been up close and personal with a cello. I mean, one of the things you can hear is how it vibrates through the floor, right into your very being. And so you have 4 strings on a cello, and when Bach, the great Baroque composer, in around 1720, wrote his first composition for this instrument. I mean, he was an organist, he played the violin, he wasn't a cellist. When he composed his first set of pieces, which are called the suites, there are sets of pieces, 6 of them, where was he going to start? And where do you start when you say, I'm now going to compose a piece for an instrument I don't play? I have never composed for it before. I mean, in fact, these are masterpieces, and they've been played continuously since the 18th century. And every cellist wants to master Bach's 6 cello suites. I'm going to just play the Prelude, so the introductory piece of the first suite. But asking the question, where do you start? Well, on a 4-stringed instrument, in a way, it's obvious that you could think of starting on one of the central strings. So here is where Bach starts, with a G. So that's your G string on the cello. And it's as if the piece, which takes about a minute to play, his first introductory piece to this G major suite, grows out of that particular string. It grows out in what looks to be quite a formally simple fashion. So on the basis of a G string, one has a harmony that sounds like that. You can hear that that is a sort of the harmony of G at rest. That then moves up to one which is slightly more in tension. So, and then add a bit more tension to that, and you get this. And then you can resolve the tension by going to, very simple, 4 chords moving from rest through tension and back to rest. I won't go into the technical details, but that's in a way what this whole piece is based on. Now the cello is not like a piano where you can easily play a chord, although I can play 3 strings more or less at the same time as I just did, so it sounds as if they're sounding together. It's more like an instrument that is appropriate for different voices. The word is polyphony. So you can have different voices playing. So those 4 chords I just played, in the middle were these notes. So those notes go up in the middle, making those particular tensions. The way Bach writes this piece is not in chordal form, but as a series of voices. Based on a repeated G, you hear that, and it gradually moves out of that and becomes a very kind of imaginative, wandering sense of fluid music. And it's often thought that Bach, whose name means a stream in German, composed a stream of musical sounds in this first prelude in order to suggest that very idea. And so, I mean, one doesn't really have to go into too much detail to realize that essentially what Bach is doing is taking a very simple set of harmonic patterns, applying them to this instrument, and actually producing a very great piece of music, a very innovative piece of music. But it demonstrates, I think, one of the first principles that anyone trying to think of creative innovation should be completely convinced of, which is that nothing comes from nothing. All innovation builds on the past. And in the case of this kind of music, it builds very specifically on repetition, on a repeated note that moves into a different sphere and then returns to rest. And what you'll hear at the very end of this 1.5-minute piece is a chord, 3 notes together for the first time. So the prelude to Bach's first suite. So, well, I hope you got a sense from that of the way the music kind of curls around a bit like a stream. At one stage, it almost disappears and goes right down and very low and then starts again, and there's a kind of cascade. And at the end, it builds up, doesn't it, so that you get that wonderful final surge until you get that beautiful chord at the end, which all seems to somehow come together. So it's a kind of repetition that comes back to its original source, which is this G major chord, but in a different configuration, which I think is a very nice metaphor for innovation. You're configuring things differently, but in a way, very often you're coming back to your starting point, but it's, by that stage, completely different. Well, how does this tie up with some of the things that I work with in ancient Greece? Well, one of the great stories that you'll all know about, a great story of problem solving from the ancient world, is that of Archimedes and the Eureka moment, which is generally told like this. The tyrant of Archimedes' city, Hieron, says to the great mathematician and inventor, I have a crown which I had commissioned. I gave the gold to an artisan and told him to make this very intricate crown. And I think he might have adulterated it with silver. But how is it possible to tell? So the story goes, Archimedes thinks, well, how is it possible to measure the density of this object? Because clearly with a bit of an intermixture of silver, it's likely to be less dense, but you can't possibly tell. You don't want to try and destroy the object because it's very valuable, and you have to find a way of measuring its volume. And he gets into his bath and he sees the water rise, and he realizes that this is how it's going to do it, and he cries out, Eureka, which in Greek means, I've got it. And he allegedly runs naked down the streets of Syracuse shouting, Eureka, Eureka! Something that modern scientists tend not to do for some reason. But that's the story. It has problems. I mean, various historical problems associated with. Actually, classicists and colleagues of mine have never really got to the bottom of. One of those problems is baths were not that common in ancient Syracuse. If you wanted to wash, you went to the baths, which is where you got steamed and scraped and so on. The idea of somehow getting into the bath and switching on the taps is a very modern phenomenon. But let us say there certainly were bathtubs of a kind. But when you then ask what was Archimedes actually discovering, the scientists say, well, actually it's not a terribly clever thing to know that if you put an object in water, the water rises. And the bigger the object, the more the water will rise. And there's another practical problem, which is that if you try to do this with an object like a gold crown, you need unbelievably precise measuring implements to get any sense of difference between a crown made of silver or a crown made of silver plus gold, which clearly they didn't have then, and it wouldn't have worked in a kind of bathtub situation. So there's a principle that Archimedes was discovering rather than a practical solution, clearly. And we know Archimedes for many of the great ideas that he produced, and they are mathematical principles, really. And it probably wasn't the principle of measuring volume, which is perhaps a less sophisticated problem than many of the ones we know that he was working on. So the question is, what was it? And what does this story of going to the baths actually tell us? Well, my idea is the first thing it tells us is that in order to solve a problem, you've got to switch off. So coming back to the theme of here we have the humanities, here we have music, here we have the idea of the conditions of innovation requiring a change of scene. I think in the case of Archimedes, the change of scene was simply that having been required to work out a very difficult problem, and we don't quite know what it was at this stage, he went off to the baths, relaxed, and the answer came to him. Okay, so that's what you might call the shower principle. There's a television series in which there's an episode called the shower principle. Someone gets into the shower to get the answer to a problem. it's a similar principle, and it's one that I think is tried and tested. You know, you'll read all the books on the conditions that you need to set yourself up to innovate or to be creative, and it's about switching off and doing something different, so that when you return, and it's a well-known phenomenon, when you return to the focus on what you're doing, you come to it with a fresh mind. But what actually is amazing to me is I think I've discovered the answer, and you've heard it here first, guys, but it's going to be published, because there's a later source for Archimedes, a 2nd century author called Athenaeus, and he gives us pages and pages of detail of a genuine historical commission that was presented to Archimedes. And he tells us that the tyrant of the city of Syracuse, who was very much into building great big catapults and weapons of war, commissioned Archimedes to design and build the biggest floating vessel that was ever put onto the water in the ancient world. It was called the Syracusia. It was 50 times bigger than any boat that had been built. It displaced a couple of thousand tons. It had a couple of thousand people who could go on board, a catapult. It had a library on board, a portico with flowers, a swimming pool, a gymnasium, and a temple to the goddess Aphrodite. And he gives all this in great detail. People worked on this massive boat for years, and it was given as a gift to the Emperor Ptolemy of Egypt, because the port of Alexandria actually was the only port in the ancient world which was big enough and deep enough to take such a huge vessel. So, I mean, just reading through the details of this, you realised what a huge task it must have been to, as it were, build a floating palace. And the question that must have been on Archimedes' mind, I think, was, will this thing float? And the answer he came up with, I mean, isn't it weird? We still call it, those of you who are engineers will know, the Archimedes Principle. It's a principle of buoyancy. It's got nothing to do with measuring volume as such. It's a principle that the force of the water that gives the upward thrust to an object that is displaced by that object has to be greater than the weight of the object itself. I mean, so that, you know, a steel supertanker can float because it conforms to Archimedes' principle of buoyancy. And this is a seriously important principle of engineering. And given that the only historical story we have of Archimedes being required to do anything is the story of his building this massive ship, the Syracusia, strikes me that it was probably the principle of buoyancy that he was trying to formulate in a mathematical way when he went into the steam bath, relaxed and realized that he had the answer, that he could prove to Hierome that this massive ship that he wanted to build was actually going to float. Anyway, so that's one example of dozens that I could give you of the mechanism, the conditions that might be required for an innovation or innovative solution to emerge. Now, you might say in terms of ancient elements, there are four: earth, fire, air, and water. So that, let's say that's water. The element of water is the element in which you immerse yourself in order to achieve some kind of creative flow. And I think I can boil down virtually all the other mechanisms of innovation into three other elements, which one might as well call air, fire, and earth. Those four elements, by the way, principles of physics, you might say, were what the ancients believed the world consisted of in its various permutations and combinations. Here again, you know, they're thinking about how can anything be created from nothing. The earliest philosophers say everything was originally water, Thales says. Then Anaximenes says, no, everything was originally air. So they're going for one element. And eventually Empedocles, the Sicilian, says, actually, it's all four. They must have been eternal elements, eternal principles, earth, fire, air, and water, and everything that is produced in the world is some combination of these four. So conveniently, I can say I can boil down the elements of innovation into these four fundamentals. First of all, the immersion that is required, the immersion and extraction, withdrawal that is required to give you that creative condition. And then secondly, well, let me give you the other three. Air is about connection, combination. Fire is about disruption or reversal. And earth is about refashioning and remoulding. And I think, in a way, all innovations, if you think about them, can fall more or less into those broad categories, with myriads, of course, of subcategories. And it's very helpful when one's thinking about, what do I do if I want to do something new? To say, well, is there some way I can perhaps connect? So that's the air, or combine. And there are examples in the ancient world of that, such as the invention of ancient sculpture. So the Greeks connected geographically with other cultures, notably ancient Egypt. And from ancient Egypt, they saw these terrific sculptural examples, but they were all rather static. So if you look at ancient Egyptian statues, they're like that. And if you look at 7th century Greek statues, they're the same. They stare ahead rigidly with very little expression, bodily or facial. But something extraordinary happens in about 100 years. And that is that Greek sculpture starts to become fluid. It starts to look like human beings. You start seeing muscles and sinews. You start seeing movement and expression. And the Greeks were the first to do this. I mean, in fact, in the ancient world, there are no other examples of this kind of extraordinary sculpture that the Greeks create. Why? Well, we've already connected with Egypt, and what we've got is the technique of sculpture. But the Greeks obviously have other things which are characteristic of their culture, one of which is the Olympic Games. Games generally, athletic games. And in athletic games, you see beautiful bodies moving. So how can you keep producing sculptures that look like that when you're confronted with the sight of beautiful bodies moving? And the other thing that the Greeks also came up with, and we have the whole tradition of the doctor called Hippocrates, was empirical anatomical observation. They were always at war with each other, the Greeks, as he states, so in a way they were always chopping up bodies anyway. But they also needed to cure them, they also needed to apply surgery to them, and they started to work out that human bodies consisted of muscles, bones and sinews. And when you put these things together, when you connect these different aspirations, you might say, for learning, how does the body work for an athlete? How does the body work for a doctor? With how do we create a sculpture of a human body, you get some of these amazing sculptures, I think, from ancient Greece. The one that's a particular favourite of mine is the discus thrower, which you may remember. It's the one where you have the athlete who's bent round like that, about to throw a discus. And in fact, in such a position that he can't stand on his own 2 feet. You have to have a central pole of some kind. Sometimes it looks as if there's a tree growing out of the middle of this person, because actually it's an off-balance sculpture. But it is a magnificent work of art. And of course, from there, it's picked up in the Renaissance by great sculptors like Michelangelo. And we have a whole Western tradition of sculpture that emerges from that. So that comes about through one of these principles, that of connection. And I've briefly only got time before I go back to the cello for a final piece to mention another, which is the principle of disruption, fire. And I like this story because I find that business people seem to resonate with it. Because, I mean, I know there's a lot of talk about disruptive innovation and that sort of thing. In a way, you have to be disruptive in order to move on to a new paradigm. Very often, I don't think it's always the case. So the example from ancient Greece that I have is that of fighting, because the Greeks were continuously fighting battles. And they had a tradition of fighting where they would line up their phalanxes, their troop dispositions, facing each other on a level plane. And they did this for centuries. And there might be 250 on the front, 12 deep fighters, thousands of fighters facing each other. And they always put the best fighters on the right flank. I mean, this was partly tradition, partly religion, partly a sense of superstition. I mean, you know, where are you going to put the key fighters? Well, you'll put them on the right. We just happen to be a right-handed human race on the whole. So that's where the good fighters go. And we know this historically. All the different Greek city-states would have this formation for their troops. The idea then is you put your best fighters on the right, and if they succeed in pushing through the right flank, they can then roll up the line, they can go behind. And what tended to happen in these battles is that as soon as the right flank was penetrated and a few people had already been killed, the other side would essentially raise the white flag. So there wouldn't be mass deaths from a lot of these battles. It was almost a formality, a bit like a rugger game or something. This went on, as I say, for hundreds of years, and the answer clearly to how you're going to win your battles in ancient Greece was train your best fighters so that they will always win. And the people who trained their best fighters were the Spartans. And so the Spartans always won. For hundreds of years, whenever you fought the Spartans won. Because they trained their fighters, and they put them on the right, they bashed through the other side, and they got the other side to surrender. Now, why is it that nobody thought of reversing that, of disrupting it, until 371 BC? Hundreds of years of Spartan domination on the battlefield, until a Theban general called Epaminondas does something completely unexpected. He puts his best fighters on the left flank. And not only does he put them on the left, he builds them up 50 deep. So there's no way that side is not going to sustain any onslaught by the best fighters on the other flank, the Spartans. And in this battle in 371, the Battle of Leuctra, with far smaller forces, something like, we think, 6,000 troops to the Spartan 12,000, Epaminondas and the Thebans win an extraordinary victory. The Spartans can't believe that their right flank isn't breaking through, quite the opposite. The other flank, which should be an easy victory for the Thebans, actually Epaminondas gets them to withdraw. So the Spartans on the left are following the withdrawing Thebans. The Thebans on the left are breaking through, and they roll up the Spartan flank, and that is a complete victory. Now, you'd have thought, okay, well, he's done it. He's disrupted the battle line. Surely everyone will learn from that. But the amazing thing is, inertia rules in so many things in the world. Actually, what happens in 362, there's another battle between the Thebans and the Spartans. The same thing happens. The Thebans again put their best fighters on the left, and again they win their battle. What happens, though, unfortunately, Epaminondas is killed. And do you know what? We don't have any records of this thing being tried again. It goes down in history as a one-off disruptive innovation, but one that was clearly immensely successful. I mean, of course, there are all kinds of other military tactics that are used to disrupt, notably those of Alexander the Great in the 3rd century, in the late 4th century. And then they're taken over by the Romans and so on. But it is interesting that this one example of just doing the opposite of what you've always done turns out to be such a successful strategy. Now, to get back to music, finally, what I showed you at the beginning was a piece in G major with a very simple pattern of harmonic changes from which it builds up. Now what I'm going to play you is a piece that was composed in 1886. It was Saint-Saëns, the French composer, Carnival of the Animals. And what's interesting about this is it's also in G major, and it also uses exactly the same patterns of harmonies. So let me just demonstrate. Here we have G major, going through the different chords until you get back to the same G major. So what are you going to do to differentiate if you're going to compose something with exactly the same harmonic pattern? Well, first of all, you do it in a slightly different rhythm. So whereas Bach has a sort of 2-beat in a bar rhythm, what Saint-Saëns does is he makes it a 3-element in a bar rhythm. Same harmonies, but they're on the piano. And the cello is doing something else. So this is a piece not just for the cello, but for the cello with a piano accompaniment. And Saint-Saëns, I think, has taken a cue from Bach, creating a kind of stream, and he's made that stream the piano. And the swan, which is the bird that is floating over the stream or the river, is the cello. And there's this beautiful melody that floats over the top of that harmonic pattern in the bass. So I'm now going to play the swan to finish off this demonstration. But I hope it shows how Saint-Saëns has innovated using absolutely the same materials that were available to Bach, but create something completely different. So just tune up, please. A bit louder. Okay, thank you. Right. The Swan by Saint-Saëns. Please. Well, I'm happy to take questions of any kind.